If you really make your hand relaxed and keep your fingers so that they really aren't moving, and you just rotate your wrist, you'll find that you can then just do a really great job without too much effort. Hello and welcome to the Heart of the Piano YouTube channel. I'm Bob Rose, and today we're going to be looking at the first movement of Bach's Italian Concerto. I love this piece, and I think that for a lot of people, Bach is not necessarily always that easy to get into, but this piece is quite easy Bach to get into. So, even in Bach's own lifetime, most people considered him as being a bit out of touch, a bit not very fashionable. Many people considered his writing to be too dense, too polyphonic, too much counterpoint, too like for scholars, which is how I think a lot of people might hear Bach now. So let me tell you what's interesting about the Bach's Italian Concerto. Bach had been really interested in the new style coming out of Italy, including composers such as Vivaldi and so on. And so he'd got hold of a lot of their scores and was studying them. And so he made a lot of transcriptions of existing concertos from Italy. He was really interested in studying them, transcribing them, and then he had a go at writing this in that style, which at that time was a much more popular style. So this is him writing in a sort of more unusual style, that instead of being, like preludes and fugues, full of a lot of dense polyphonic textures, this is much more happy, simple, accessible music for the masses. And in fact, there was one famous critic of the time that usually was just not liking what Bach did. And when Bach came out with the Italian Concerto, this critic was like, this is great. This is a really great piece of music. So, I recommend going and listening to a lot of the concertos that Bach transcribed, as well as Bach's own transcriptions of Italian concertos. It's very happy, very simple. And you want to imagine an orchestra, like the kind of orchestra you'd get with a Vivaldi concerto, for example. Now, because this video has taken me a while to get around to recording, because I've been up to a lot of things. So one of the things that I've been up to is working on my sight reading app, and that's really coming along well. So I have a lot of exciting announcements with that. But anyway, back to the task at hand. I've had a lot of time to think about how I would play this particular movement of the Italian Concerto, because unlike a lot of classical music, the problem with Bach is that he doesn't write in huge amounts of the instructions that from the Romantic era onwards composers would write in. So things like articulations and slurring, and we in a lot of ways we just simply don't know exactly how Bach would have wanted people to play this. But a lot of people have ideas by studying what composers of the time said. So that there's a lot of scholars who will say that there are correct and incorrect ways to play Bach, and I don't like this notion of correct and incorrect. But having said that, there are certainly more appropriate, and there are certainly sort of more stylistically appropriate. And the tricky thing is that ultimately the way that we want to play is, well, what do we love? What makes us feel, this music is lovable? What do we love? Now, the problem is that the more you listen to classical music, the more you listen particularly to Baroque music, you realize that there is a whole world of conventions and standards that people have to it. So what you wouldn't do is play it with a lot of pedal in a very romantic way. And when I say romantic, I don't mean sort of very sentimental and sort of with lots of love, but romantic as in capital R, as in romantic era music. So if I go... I mean, I suppose, in some ways we could do that, but we just don't, because that's just not the convention. And a lot of people would be quite horrified by you doing that. Now, if you're taking an exam, then really you should think a little bit about how this might come across to an examiner, but not in a, oh, I have to play this correctly. And if I don't play this correctly in the correct way, the examiner is going to go, no, that's wrong. Just bear in mind that there are certain conventions, and if you break those conventions, the examiner is going to raise an eyebrow and be less inclined to want to give you a good mark. So, it's way beyond the scope of this particular video to talk about Baroque versus classical. But what it does need is sort of quite... you don't want to pull the rhythm around too much. You don't want a huge amount of rubato. You can have a little bit, but little bit of rubato, and you don't want to use tons and tons of pedal. Although I use a little bit of pedal, it's all about balance. But I'll come to this in a minute. But let me talk about all the sort of various choices that you can have in this piece right from the beginning, because you just have so many choices open to you. One of the first choices that you're going to have is what you do with the first chord, because the way it's written here is just a block chord. Most people are going to spread this. And I normally don't do this, but before recording this video, I went and had a look at other tutorials and to see masterclasses and to see how other people have been teaching this. And there's a really interesting masterclass with Andras Schiff, and he was trying to get the student to do a really nice, and he didn't describe in words how he wants this chord, but I think that what he should have said is that you don't really want to emphasize the top of the chord, because I think that what a lot of people will do is to go, and I think that what Andras Schiff was getting at is that if you emphasize the bottom and slow it down a little bit, so emphasize the bottom and take your time spreading it. So not and not, but more. And emphasize the bottom. And this sort of gives it a more drum. Because, if we want the sound of a full orchestra, in Bach's time, his keyboards were a lot smaller. He couldn't have gone, whatever. This. His keyboards were a lot lighter. So this kind of spreading gives it more body, more depth. But it's got to be very grand. It's like really a fanfare. So not super fast, emphasizing the tops. And then the next thing, and you're going to think that this is a crazy amount of fussy detail, but the more we take care of the fussy details right at the beginning of the piece, it then shapes all the other details later on. So there's a very famous book on articulations in Bach. And in this book, it actually does talk about the first two notes of the right hand. And it says that if you do them as a slur, ba ya ba ba, ba ya ba ba, that this is simply wrong. It is just wrong, and not what you are supposed to do. Now, what I think is really interesting is that there are plenty of pianists, very famous ones who I love. And I can't remember, there's one recording in particular that is really nice. It's taken from a live clip. I'm going to just have a quick clip of it here so that you can listen to it. And it's really interesting that, he's a very well-respected pianist, and he goes, ba, ya, ba, ba. And I've got to admit that when I first started looking at this, I wanted to go, ba, ya, ba, 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 ya, ba, ba. But then, I thought about it for a bit, and I did sort of think about this book saying, no, this is wrong, you mustn't do that. And I've got to admit that when I imagine an orchestra playing it, in my imagination, an orchestra would not go, ba ya ba ba. The violins would just not go ba ya ba ba. And over time, I started to sort of go towards ba 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 da. Same thing here, ba 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 ba. And then what I do is I come up with my hand, ba 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 ba. But what is really important is that every time you've got these isolated high notes, which are scattered all the way through this piece of music, you don't want to go bang, 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 bang. And this is going to be sort of really important when you get to the end of the page, like for example, bar 26. If I go from bar 25, you don't want to go bing. Let me do it badly, where you really ping the top note. You don't want to go bam, bam, but more like, if anything, think about how you'd sing it. Da 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 ba da 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 ba. It's not da 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 ba. So I'm going to have to turn that one down. And so a lot of what I do here are sort of very gentle motions, where I sort of go, I almost play it sideways. So it doesn't just go straight down into the note. And then there's lots of other places later on where you get that kind of thing. So you don't want to go it's very gentle. You don't. You want to imagine a beautiful singer. Da 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 da. Not da 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 da. It's really harsh. And I know that a lot of people will probably play in that way. You need to be very gentle with these high notes, so that it's not like a singer shattering glass every time they go to a high note. Anyway, so I've sort of thought in the end, ba-yam, ba-yam, sort of really emphasizing the bottom. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. So, and by the way, another thing that this book points out is that when you're playing Bach, you do not just play everything legato. It's not. Or even things like. This is not really how you want to play Bach. And then it also says, on the other hand, you don't want to play everything just staccato either. This kind of thing. It's a mixture. And the art of knowing which things to have legato and which things to have staccato, this is probably where you will need a teacher for a lot of this stuff. But you can also, just listen to a lot of Baroque music and you'll gradually start to get an idea of things like phrasing. So here I personally have so this is all legato. Now, when it comes to things like this, the right hand here from like bar 9 onwards, when I listen to a lot of the concert pianists, the famous concert pianists playing it, they tend to play it all very legato, like. I don't like it that way. A lot of people argue that Bach was a legato composer and criticize people like Glenn Gould for being very much more. I have to admit that for a long time I didn't like Bach. I didn't really get Bach until about my mid-20s when I started hearing Glenn Gould. I'd not really heard Glenn Gould much up until my mid-20s. And then that very sort of staccato style, I was like, wow, I love that. It's not for everyone. But what I will say in my defense, that I prefer to hear. Whoop, that was too bash there. Much more gentle. So that sort of more detached staccato style when you do look at what the composers of the time said about how you should do articulations, they did say that when you're playing fast pieces, you are then more likely to play very fast passages of semiquavers or 16th notes, that they can be much more detached and staccato. So although a lot of professionals will go... I think that there's a case for where there's staccato, because the people did say in those times that fast, very fast passages such as this, you could do that way. So then another thing that I sort of realized that I wasn't sure about. So we've got I kept wanting to put a gap in here. I kept wanting to go da da dum da 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 da. So I da 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 gap dum da. But then I realised after a while, I don't think I really want that, and I'm not sure why I wanted to do that, because this is not the tonic. There's some tension here. This is unresolved, and it needs to go back to here. So, not resolved, resolved. So, so keep it going. Now, another detail in bar 4 is a lot of, so many performers that I hear go ba ba in the right hand, ba 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 in the right hand. And I'm just not sure about that. So something like that, and I'm just not sure. I really do think that it needs to go ba da. Tension and release again. Da dum bum ba da dum da 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 da. There's a tension and it releases. Something like that. And then I started thinking about, well, why might people want to do that separately? I personally came to the conclusion that, and it's very, very rare that I ever want to change anything that a genius composer wrote down. But you've got to bear in mind, though, that when Bach wrote stuff down on manuscript, he made a lot of mistakes. And a lot of it you were just expected to fix. There were certain accidentals you were supposed to just hear and go, oh, no, that's not what he meant. Now, what he's written in bar 4 is a crotchet or a quarter note with the stem going up that you hold on to. So it's like, and then you just hold on to this note as the tenor voice, and the bass note, the bass voice goes ba bum bum bum. So ba 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 bum ba bum bum ba 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 ba, and you have this tenor voice holding on there. I realised though, if you're going to jump, so if you're going to have, and you have that jump down, well then at the end of the 4 bars in the left hand, you need that same jump down with your left hand. And I think it's probably implied that you go ba 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 ba. It's implied that that's a jump down with the tenor part that gets held on. I've decided that because I want a bit more thematic continuity, a bit more structure, that if you've got this, ba ba, it then wants to go ba ba in the left hand. So with this same jump in the left hand, which is not what Bach wrote, but I prefer it to what most people do, which is putting the gap in the right hand. I just don't like that. Or they even go, and I think the reason why they do that is because of tension and release. So now the way I see this is it's a tension and a release. But then it's not over. There's a gap. And I think the reason why some people go is that the louder you make it, the more you signpost and say, there's more, wait, there's tension. So if I go with the tension at the end of the 4 bars, No. Let me do that again. So at the end of the 4 bars, with the tension at the end of the 4th bar, it gives more of a sense of, oh, it's not over, it's not over. But I quite like the sense of giving a resolution and then, but leaving you kind of stumped, because the resolution, it's not on a strong beat. It's 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. And that resolution doesn't happen on the 1 or the 2. It's just 1. And you're left going, huh? Why did you stop? What happened? I think that's enough. So I like that. So. And then there's like, oh, what's next? And then. Same thing. And then you're left going, okay, what's next? Too strong. So, this is kind of the level of detail that I like to think about it. Because if you just go... you're not really setting the tone for everything else that follows, So, anyway, moving on. This is really important because this just comes up over and over again. I think... when I listen to a lot of Italian concertos played by concert pianists, I can tell that they've been practiced with a metronome. I can even get a metronome where you go tap, 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 and it shows you what speed you're at. And it's like literally the speed never wavers. It's as if they're playing to a metronome. I don't like music played in this way. Now, things like I like an Agogic accent there. So Agogic accents are where you, instead of doing the accent with loudness, with volume, you can do it this way. And all I've done is I've just delay it ever so slightly. And when you delay something, you kind of bring emphasis onto it. So, and the way to do that, to have the delay, is if you lift your hand up, you do it very naturally, because otherwise your hand will just go straight there. But if I go, I build into my muscle memory what that pause feels like. If I just go under pressure, that'll disappear. And also it just doesn't sound good because I'm not playing it with my body. If I go, that movement is something that a listener will feel with their body, that I've done some kind of gesture. It's a physical gesture. So, and I love that way of phrasing it. Let me do it from the beginning so you can kind of hear how all this starts to fit together. So you can hear that this is all really kind of starting to come together now. And I'm using, just enough pedal, just little dabs of pedal. This raises a really thorny point that whenever you play Bach on the piano, no matter what you do, doesn't matter however you play, the Bach police will come after you for something that you've done. Because this wasn't written for a piano. It was written for a harpsichord, where you had 2 manuals. One could be loud, one could be quiet, and we'll come to this in a minute. But basically, it wasn't written for an instrument that's anything like the instrument that we have now. And in my opinion, this is just my opinion. A lot of people have different opinions about this. But Bach would take any of his pieces, and if anyone gave him money at the drop of a hat, he would instantly rearrange it for a different group of instruments. We know this is something that Bach just did. So what I imagine is that I am playing an arrangement of this piece that is not the same as the original. So if I want to play it with all the things that a modern piano gives me, such as pedal, such as phrasing, such as shades of quiet and loud, I'm allowed to do that because this is an arrangement for a different instrument. So in the same way that if Bach had arranged this for an orchestra, he would not have made the orchestra only play at just one fixed volume. He wouldn't have done that. He would have got them playing all the shades, all the different ways of phrasing and graduations of quiet to loud. He would have done all of that. So why shouldn't we do this at the piano, But I do think that although we're playing it on the piano, and I've said this in other videos, 99.9% of the time when we are playing classical piano, we don't want to be just hearing a piano. Almost everything that we play at the piano, internally, we want to be imagining other instruments. And when I'm playing this, I'm hearing an orchestra. It's so much better when you imagine the orchestral textures. So anyway, bearing that in mind, let's sort of gradually move our way onwards. So the next significant thing that kind of jumps out at me, we've got... Now, you want to be careful with the balance of how you do this. You don't want to be too over the top. It's all about good taste. So too much, but I bet you that most people won't even go anywhere near that side of it. Most people will be afraid to go up to that. Let me see what I would think of as a good balance. Okay. Something like that. Oh, too loud. Now, another thing that I want to talk about, things like snaps, rhythm snaps. Something, by the way, that I noticed at the end of bar 7. A lot of concert pianists do this, and I don't like it. So same thing with the end of bar 3. So they go da 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 da. They rush da da da. So I like that, just da da da. Don't rush those things. Da ba ba 1 2 1 2 1 da da da. But so many concert pianists just go da 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 and rush it. I don't like that. Having said that, though, when we get to bar 13, we want a little bit the opposite of that. So what I like is now these things here, I see them as like very fast grace notes. Da-da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da. So let me go from a bit before. This is from bar 11. By the way, whenever you're watching my videos, I recommend that you have the sheet music open in front of you, which saves me crazy amounts of time having to constantly keep editing to add the sheet music. So, have the sheet music open in front of you so that you can follow what I'm doing. Anyway, so we've got... So what I'm doing is I'm basically going ba, da, 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 and then squeezing in those notes. Sorry. And everyone does that. That's generally kind of what you do. If you play it as written, it's more like... it gets very... It sort of trips over itself. It's quite tricky, but... you just kind of squeeze them in. And then another thing that I notice a lot of concert pianists don't do, and in my opinion really should do, and it's a tricky one because I should have mentioned this before, but we don't have a surviving manuscript of in Bach's own handwriting, or even of his copyist as Bach was giving it to him in the manuscript. All we've got is like the first edition and some and things written on manuscript that we think were written after the first published edition. So we have less of an idea about exactly what Bach intended than usual on this one. But what he writes here that I think I do like, that apparently he wrote here. If you look at bar 15 and look at the first note of each group of 4 in the right hand, there is a staccato, and then slurs on the next 3 notes. Now, to do this, it's quite important that you allow your hand to move around this. You can't really go. That's really difficult to do, and when you're adding the left hand, that's too much for your brain to think about. But if you go ba and pull your hand away, and then and then you could do this like circles, that kind of thing. So you can see that just becomes part of my muscle memory, and I don't need to think about it. And it really makes a difference, because I think so many professionals they're going, and then they just go, which is just dull. It's just boring. It's just boring. So. And also these ones I really like in bar 19. I like that crescendo into those. You can rush those a little bit, I think, because it really adds to the character of it. So let me go from bar 13. And then I like the crescendoing up to. And then in bar 25, I like sort of coming down. So we've got, let's see. Because tension and release, you've had all this stuff basically on the dominant, all dominant, waiting to resolve to the tonic, all dominant, and then you resolve. And when you resolve, you generally get quieter. So, and then you come up to this point here. So something else I wanted to talk about as well was, I've been looking at this for quite a few weeks, and for a few weeks I was sort of struggling to really think exactly how I wanted. Every sort of way that I was playing it, I wasn't fully happy with. And then I made a realization that just absolutely unlocked this for me. And this is thinking about the brightness of certain keys and how some keys are brighter than other keys. So this is that, when a lot of people say that major is happy and minor is sad, what they're really talking about is that the major key has more sharps compared to a minor key. So, if you think about C major, and it's just that there's no sharps or flats. When you think about the minor, you've got 3 flats in it. And the more flats you have, the less brightness that sound has. And you can look at this if you look at modes and you work your way all the way from the Locrian mode all the way through to the Lydian mode. The more sharps that each mode has, the sort of happier and brighter that mode becomes. If you don't know anything about modes, don't worry about it. They'll be for a completely different video. But basically, going to sharper keys is sort of like gives it more energy, and it's like the sun comes out and it lifts you. And then what I realized is it starts off, we think we're in F major. F major. F major. What's this note? What's this note doing here? It's an E flat. It's as if we're not really in F. It's as if we're starting on the dominant. It feels like actually it wants to go to B flat. Now, we know it doesn't because this piece of music is so famous that it's like, well, of course it's in F. It's just in F because we've heard it 1,000 times. But if you'd never heard it before, it sounds like it's in F. But now it's like, oh no, No, that we were just on the dominant, but because of the E flat, it sounds like no, we're actually in the key of B flat major, and this is 2 flats, and then it stops. So it feels like it wants to go to B flat, but then it goes up. It's like, whoa, where did that come from? To a sharper key, a key that now doesn't have any flats, because the key we started in had 1 flat. So we went, which sounds like we want to go to the key with 2 flats. And then he goes, fooled you. I'm actually taking you up. Because for a long time I just sort of didn't get, what do I do with this? But it's like, so you know those pop songs, and you know there's cheesy moments sometimes where it just suddenly goes up a key. Almost near the end of the song, something like there's that Whitney Houston song, and you get that sort of there's a lot of viral videos where you wait for the drum to come in, and they're waiting for that, and then it goes bam. So you know the song I mean, and you've got that sort of key change that suddenly takes it all up a level, and that's basically what Bach is doing here. He's fooled you. You're expecting to go down and resolve, but he doesn't. He goes, we're going even higher. And then now it sounds like we're in C, back in F, and so on and so on. Now there's a lot of moments where he does sort of weird things that makes you go, why has he done that? So like over the page, bar 31. So this note here, isn't that sort of a bit odd and a bit surprising? And for a long time, I was sort of thinking to myself, well, why does he keep putting these notes in? And so much of what he's doing here is just sort of as a way of constantly pushing the key into sharper areas, more sharps, to build the excitement. And then the sequences like... up, up, up. So all these kinds of things are all the way through it. And if you play it, sort of always looking out for, and now he's just going to raise the energy. Raise the energy. Now so then here, I don't hang about here. You could sort of go from the C from bar 5. You know, you could have a gap there. You could like a gap. But I don't hang about. I just come straight back in, because that's a moment of release where we've just come straight back, where we're heading straight back to the tonic. So go from bar 5. Okay, maybe that was a bit too soon, but that kind of thing. Sharper. Back to C. And so on and so on. So something that's going to, moving significantly forward, something that's going to trip a lot of people up, and I think something that's going to make a lot of people go, oh my God, this is actually a really difficult piece of music, are the trills. And there's a real easy trick to trills, which is just to do this. You know, you just rotate. So, you know, there's 3 axes that we can move our hands in. There's this, and there's this. Now, arguably, this isn't really the wrist. I should have said like 3 axes you can move your wrist in. So up and down, left and right, and then rotate. Now, rotate really isn't the wrist. It actually the whole forearm, but it feels like it's in the wrist. And if you spend some time away from the piano, just experimenting with like, you know, being a mixing machine, you know, like, what's it called? Blender. You know, you imagine a blender. You imagine your hands are like blenders and you want this kind of loose motion. When you do that, it's incredibly easy to do trills. Now, I don't mind doing trills with my fingers, but there are certain places where I want to do very, very rapid trills where you just you just do that, and you just do it with your fingers. But you don't move your fingers. You keep your fingers absolutely without any movement in the fingers at all. And if you do this, you will absolutely just get that trill. So, for example, you know, the trill, I think a lot of people are going to be quite intimidated by. Let's see if we go. I'm in bar 112. You could just go. And you're just literally rotating. Now, what a lot of you will probably try to do is to also try and move your fingers, like the thumb and your third finger, as you're doing that. And all you're doing is just making a more chaotic system. If you really make your hand relaxed and keep your fingers so that they really aren't moving, and you just rotate your wrist, you'll find that you can then just do a really great job without too much effort. Now, obviously, you're not just immediately going to do this. You're going to have to build up to this. But the point is, you just put your fingers on the keys and start rotating backwards and forwards. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to basically do this away from the piano, on a table. And you just practice on the table, just building up to doing that. Because what happens, sometimes with my students, I get them to not come anywhere near a piano for like a week or 2 weeks and tell them that all their practice has to be on an air piano or on a table or whatever, because they get it. They can do it absolutely fine. And the moment they start to come anywhere near a piano, the wrist gets tense, everything gets tense, and suddenly they can't do it anymore because there's something psychological about approaching a piano that makes people scared and tense, where away from the piano they can do it. So to practice this away from the piano where everything feels very relaxed, and gradually ease yourself in so that you can do this on the piano, because I bet you that you can do this on the table. So it's just wrist rotation where you can do this. And then there's other places where I try and squeeze in very, very, very rapid trills. The way that some trills have been written, like, for example, in bar 91, some pianists kind of cheat and put these in front of the beat. And hopefully, if you're watching this, hopefully most of you know that ornamentation in Bach, the ornament happens on the beat. Too much to go into in this particular video. But if I go from bar 90, we want... So they're very hard to squeeze in. And by the way, in ABRSM, you don't have to do any of the ornamentation, I think. You can literally just leave them all out if you really, really don't like doing them. But you will obviously get better marks when you put them in. And here... I mean, I need to practice those a little bit, but what I basically am doing, because at first when I tried to do those just with fingers, like just using my fingers without my wrist, they're really hard to squeeze in. But if you go, and it's sort of like almost like a little spasm in your wrist. You imagine just like, and you don't do it with your fingers, it's with your wrist. So... And then what I needed to do to practice just for a little while was to practice not moving my fingers, which is harder said than done in that moment because your fingers want to pull at the keys. Oh, yeah. So there, I was really conscious about not moving the fingers, and instantly they just sounded so much better. But that is mostly wrist. So think about the wrist to help you with some of these articulations. But most of the people who I teach, and I've spoken about this in other videos, so if you want to know more about this in particular, watch my video on scales and arpeggios, because I talk a lot about that this particular issue, where students lock up their wrists. And wrists are locked up because of when the nervous system goes into fight, flight, it's very natural that the wrist just basically tense so that we can punch our way out of danger. So if we're like going, I don't feel safe, the wrists lock up so that we can punch whoever wants to attack us or punch the lion that's about to attack us or whatever. But we need to be very loosey-goosey with our wrists. So, we practice away from the piano and then with a very loose wrist. But we can't do it if we're tense. Oh, one more really, really important thing. Yes, absolutely. This is absolutely something that people are going to be listening out for. So, as I was saying before, this was written for a 2-manual keyboard instrument that had one manual, but a manual is basically one keyboard. So there was like a keyboard here and a keyboard above it. And so this is written as if it's supposed to be a concerto. So this is like the whole orchestra, forte, the whole orchestra. You imagine the whole Tutti orchestra. And then when you sort of get at the end of the page, you get to bar 30, and it goes piano at the bottom in the left hand, and then forte at the top. It doesn't literally mean that you have to play the right hand forte. What it means is that the right hand is the soloist, and the left hand is accompanying. So, you don't really want to go, let me go... you don't want to go, this is quiet, and then you go... That's not what it means. It's just like the right hand is the soloist, the left hand isn't. So you can play the right hand from, bar 31. Oh, here's another one where you're going to want a little bit of wrist rotation. Here's where I like to put pedal, by the way. A lot of people won't like that. I like it. Anyway, so I really like performances where you hear the differences between the Tutti whole orchestra and the bits where the soloist comes in. And again, I'm shocked by how many really of the top, most regarded recordings, you can barely hear a difference. But, if I take it from... like you are hearing, everyone's suddenly gone quieter and you're hearing the flautist or I like flute for this. And by the way, there are plenty of recordings on Spotify where people have arranged this for soloists, such as I think there's one for flute, I think there's one for oboe, I think there are various string versions knocking around. You absolutely want to go off and listen to some of those so you can hear these kinds of textures as you do it. So what I like is pedal here, and then without pedal, like, so it's kind of skips through that, like let me do it faster. And I really like, you really want to think about which parts. There is still a lot of counterpoint in here, even though it's not as much counterpoint as usual for Bach. But you really want to sort of look for other things that you can bring out. So something else that you want to think about as well. So this bar 31, don't just go... I used to be a semi-professional viola player. And let me tell you that being a viola player, when you're playing Baroque music, is so boring. So the violinists get all the great tunes, da 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 da, and then the violas are doing the equivalent of this. They're going bum 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 bum. So so when I'm hearing, I'm very, very familiar with this kind of. And you want it to sound beautiful, it's not just plonk, 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 plonk. It's very light, It's in the background. It's sort of it's not exactly staccato, but it's jump, 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 jump. You want to be imagining violas and second violins, that kind of texture. Jump, 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 jump. So. And here I like. And so on and so on and so on, but just, you know, nice and all the way through. I cannot emphasize enough how you want to be focusing on timbres and textures. So like there's this one really beautiful bit where you've got, I really like pedal here because it just sweetens it. But even if I don't use pedal, let me just go. By the way, I really like playing around with certain bits of this. Like, I've not heard anyone else do this, but I like holding on to. And I'm trying to sort of hold on to certain notes there anyway. And hopefully you can hear that what I'm doing there, I'm imagining all the beautiful textures of maybe a flautist. It's full of gorgeous, gorgeous orchestral colours. Don't just be like, you know, do you know what I mean? Listen to how beautiful all these various different textures are. So anyway, I think that really is going to be it for all the things that I want to talk about. I'm going to be going through doing tutorials and performances of all the pieces in the 2027-2028 ABRSM Grade 8 book, and then moving on to the other ones. So if you're interested in those, do click on subscribe and like, and you know, all that good stuff at the bottom of the page. And I do have a few spaces in my online studio for more students. If you're interested, I'm going to leave links in the description below. Yeah, so go and do some practice or watch more of my videos, and take care and goodbye. Bye.